Agatha Christie, Problem at Pollensa Bay. It was early morning in Palma when Mr. Parker Pyne stepped off the steamer that plied between Barcelona and Mallorca. He disembarked only to meet his first disappointment. The hotels were full. The best he was offered was a room the size of a china cupboard, overlooking a dismal inner courtyard. Mr. Parker Pyne, naturally, could not agree to this, but the hotel proprietor seemed entirely unmoved by his client's distress. "What is one to do?" he murmured with a shrug of his shoulders. Palma had become a fashionable resort. The exchange rate was favorable, and in winter, Mallorca drew everyone, the English, the Americans, everyone. The place was packed, and the prospect of a senior English gentleman finding lodgings seemed doubtful. His only hope, it appeared, was the neighboring island of Formentera, where prices were so extortionate that foreigners generally steered clear. Mr. Parker Pyne enjoyed a coffee and a roll, then set off to inspect the cathedral. However, he soon realized that in his current state of mind, he was in no mood for architectural beauty. He sought the counsel of a friendly taxi driver, who peppered his broken French with scraps of the local Spanish dialect. He inquired whether it was worth trying his luck in Soler, Alcudia, Pollensa, or Formentera, where the hotels were excellent, if notoriously expensive. Mr. Parker Pyne decided to inquire exactly how expensive they were. According to the driver, the prices were absurd. Was it not a well-known fact that the English had always come here specifically for the modest, low costs? Mr. Parker Pyne agreed that this was true, but nevertheless, what did they charge at Formentera? Incredibly much. Quite so. But how much exactly? At last, the driver reluctantly named a figure. It did not particularly shock Mr. Parker Pyne. The profiteering of hotels in Jerusalem and Egypt was still fresh in his memory. A bargain was struck. Mr. Parker Pyne's suitcases were tossed somewhat carelessly into the taxi, and he set off to tour Mallorca. He peered into cheaper hotels and pensions along the way, though Formentera remained the ultimate goal of his journey. But they never reached that final stronghold of the plutocracy. As they drove through the narrow streets of Pollensa and followed the curving coastline, they came upon a small hotel called the Pino d'Oro, standing at the very water's edge. The view from its windows, through the morning haze, had the exquisite, blurred outlines of a Japanese print. Mr. Parker Pyne knew instantly that this, and only this, was what he had been looking for. He stopped the taxi and walked through the painted gates of the hotel in search of shelter. The elderly couple who owned the hotel knew neither English nor French. Nevertheless, the matter was settled to everyone's satisfaction. Mr. Parker Pyne was granted a room overlooking the sea. His bags were unpacked. The driver congratulated his passenger on escaping the monstrous expenses of those new hotels, collected his fare, and departed with a jaunty Spanish salute. Mr. Parker Pyne glanced at his watch. Finding it was only 10:15, he stepped out onto the small terrace bathed in dazzling morning sunlight and ordered a second coffee and rolls. There were 4 tables. At one sat Pyne himself. A second was being cleared after breakfast. The remaining 2 were occupied. At the nearest sat a family, father, mother, and 2 grown-up daughters. They were Germans. Behind them, in a corner of the terrace, sat some English people, clearly a mother and son. The woman was about 55. She had gray hair of a pleasant shade and dressed with taste, though in an old-fashioned style, a tweed jacket and skirt. She carried herself with the quiet assurance of an Englishwoman accustomed to traveling abroad. The young man opposite her was perhaps 25. He, too, was a typical representative of his generation and class. Of medium height, neither handsome nor plain, he was evidently on excellent terms with his mother. They exchanged small jokes, and he was attentive to her every need. As they chatted, the mother's eyes met Parker Pyne's. Her gaze flickered over him with the well-bred indifference of her kind, but Pyne knew he had already been appraised and labeled. He was recognized as a fellow countryman. In due course, he would no doubt be addressed with some polite, non-committal remark. Mr. Parker Pyne had no objection. Abroad, his compatriots often irritated him slightly, but he was always ready to be friendly. It helped pass the hours. In a small hotel, one could hardly do otherwise without creating a sense of awkwardness. And this woman certainly possessed what he called impeccable hotel manners. The young Englishman rose, made a light-hearted parting remark, and went inside. The woman took up her handbag and her post, then settled into a chair facing the sea, her back to Mr. Parker Pyne. She unfolded the Continental Daily Mail. As he finished his coffee, Pyne glanced her way and suddenly stiffened. He felt a twinge of alarm for his peaceful holiday. The woman's back was remarkably expressive. In his time, he had even classified a great variety of human backs. She sat so straight and rigid that, even without seeing her face, Pyne was certain her eyes were bright with unshed tears and that she was holding herself together by a desperate effort of will. Stealthily, Mr. Pyne retreated into the hotel. Scarcely half an hour had passed since he had been asked to sign the visitor's book. In the book, in a neat hand, was written, C. Parker Pyne, London. A few lines above, he saw the entry, Mrs. R. Chester, Mr. Basil Chester, Home Park, Devon. Seizing a pen, Mr. Pyne hastily scribbled an addition over his own signature. Now, the entry could be read, though with some difficulty, as Christopher Pyne. If Mrs. R. Chester was unhappy in Pollensa Bay, he had no intention of making it easy for her to seek his professional advice. It never ceased to amaze him how many people he encountered abroad knew his name. His holidays had been interrupted before, forcing him to solve puzzles ranging from murder to attempted blackmail. But on Majorca, he was determined to rest. Yet, he had a feeling that a distressed mother might just shatter that peace. Mr. Parker Pyne liked the Pinot d'Oro very much. Nearby was a larger hotel, the Mariposa, where many English people stayed, and around it lay an entire colony of artists. A coastal path led to the nearby village. There, one found a cocktail bar where the holiday makers congregated and a handful of small shops. Everything about the place seemed charming and peaceful. Young women strolled about in trousers with bright scarves knotted around their torsos. Long-haired young men in berets argued at Mac's bar over such weighty matters as plastic form and abstraction in art. The following day, Mrs. Chester approached Mr. Pyne with a few commonplace remarks about the local scenery and the fine weather, which, she observed, would likely hold. Later, she chatted briefly with the German lady about knitting and politely exchanged a few words concerning the troubled political situation with two Danes who killed time by rising at dawn and hiking for 11 hours a day. Mr. Parker Pyne found Basil Chester to be a thoroughly likable young man. The lad addressed Pyne as Sir and listened with polite attention to everything the older gentleman had to say. Occasionally, the three English people would take their after-dinner coffee together. On the fourth day, Basil excused himself after about 10 minutes, leaving Mr. Parker Pyne alone with Mrs. Chester. They spoke of flowers and gardening, the lamentable state of the English pound, the rising cost of living in France, and the increasing difficulty of obtaining a decent afternoon tea. Every evening, as Basil departed, Mr. Pyne noticed a slight quiver in his mother's lips, a tremor she was quick to suppress. Mrs. Chester would then regain her composure and resume their polite conversation on the aforementioned topics. Gradually, she began to speak of Basil, of his successes at school, of how well-liked he was, of how proud his father would have been had he lived, and of her gratitude that Basil had never been wild. Of course, I have always encouraged him to seek out young people, but he truly seems to prefer my company, she mentioned, with a touch of modest satisfaction. But this time, Mr. Parker Pyne did not return the usual polite platitude that came so easily to him. Instead, he remarked, "There seems to be an abundance of young people here. Not in our hotel, perhaps, but in the neighborhood." He noticed Mrs. Chester stiffen at his words. "Yes, there were a great many artists," she replied. Perhaps she was behind the times. Real art was something quite different, of course, but many young men used the pretext of painting simply to lounge about and do nothing. And the girls drank far too much. The next day, Basil said to Mr. Parker Pyne, "I'm awfully glad you're here, sir, especially for my mother's sake. She enjoys her chats with you in the evenings." "And what did you do before I arrived?" "Oh, to tell the truth, we usually played piquet." "I see. Piquet gets a bit tedious, of course. Fact is, I've got a few pals here, a very jolly crowd, but I don't think Mother quite approves of them." He laughed, as if he thought the notion rather amusing. "Mother is very old-fashioned. Even girls in trousers shock her." "Quite so," said Mr. Parker Pyne. "I'm always telling her she must move with the times. The girls we see back home are dreadfully dull." "I understand," Mr. Parker Pyne murmured. The story interested him. He had become a spectator to a small drama, though he had no intention of taking a part in it. Then, from Mr. Parker Pyne's point of view, the worst happened. A talkative lady of his acquaintance took up residence at the Mariposa. They encountered one another in a shop, in the presence of Mrs. Chester. "Not Mr. Parker Pyne?" the newcomer shrieked. "The one and only Mr. Parker Pyne, and Adela Chester. Do you two know each other?" "You do." "Staying in the same hotel?" "This is the one and only magician, Adela, the wonder of the age. Have patience. We shall dispel all your cares." "What? You didn't know? You must have heard of him. Haven't you seen his advertisements? Are you in trouble? Consult Mr. Parker Pyne. Nothing is impossible for him. Husbands and wives at each other's throats, he reconciles them. If you've lost interest in life, he plunges you into a thrilling adventure. I speak the truth. The man is a positive wizard." The effusive praise continued for some time. In the gaps, Mr. Parker Pyne attempted a few sheepish protests. He did not like the look Mrs. Chester cast in his direction, but he liked even less the way she whispered with his talkative admirer on the walk back along the beach. The climax came sooner than he expected. That same evening, after coffee, Mrs. Chester said without preamble, "Would you mind stepping into the small sitting room with me, Mr. Pyne? I wish to speak with you." He could only bow and comply. Mrs. Chester was at the end of her tether. No sooner had the door closed than she sat down and burst into tears. "Mr. Pyne, my boy, you must save him. We must save him. My heart is breaking." "My dear lady, as a stranger, Nina Wycherley says you could do anything. She says I must trust you implicitly. She told me to tell you everything, and that you would set things right." Pyne muttered a silent curse at the meddlesome Mrs. Wycherley and resigned himself to his fate. "Very well. Let us discuss the matter," he said. "A girl, I presume? Did he tell you about her?" "Only in passing." Mrs. Chester unleashed a torrent of words. The girl was dreadful. She drank, she swore. She wore no clothes to speak of. Her sister lived here on the island, married to a Dutch artist. A most undesirable connection. Half these artists lived with their companions in sin. Basil was like a different person. He had always been so steady, so interested in serious things. At one time, he had even thought of taking up archaeology. Well, said Mr. Parker Pyne, nature will have its way. What do you mean by that? An interest in serious subjects is bad for the health of young men. They ought to be falling head over ears in love with every girl they meet. Please don't joke, Mr. Pyne. I am perfectly serious. Was it this young lady, by any chance, who was having tea with you yesterday? He remembered her. He remembered the gray flannel trousers, the crimson scarf bound tight across her chest, the vivid scarlet lips, and the fact that she had preferred a cocktail to tea. So you've seen her? Ghastly. Such girls never used to appeal to Basil. And yet, you haven't often given him the opportunity to be appealed to by girls, have you? He enjoyed your company far too much. That is a bad sign. However, I dare say he will recover, provided you do not force the issue. You do not understand. You want to marry this girl, this Betty Gregg. They are engaged. Has it gone as far as that? Yes. Mr. Pyne, you must do something. You must save my boy from this disastrous marriage. Otherwise, his whole life will be ruined. No one can ruin a person's life, said Mr. Pyne, except that person themselves. But Basil's life will be ruined, Mrs. Chester insisted. I'm not worried about Basil. Surely you don't mean the girl? No, I am concerned for you. You are wasting your time. Mrs. Chester looked at Parker Pyne in mild bewilderment. How do we live between 20 and 40? He continued. We are bound hand and foot by our love affairs. As it should be, for that is life. But then comes a new stage. You gain the ability to reflect, to observe life, to discover things in others, and to value yourself truly. Life acquires a meaning. You see it as a whole, not as a series of episodes in which you are merely an actor. Neither man nor woman is truly themselves until they are past 45. That is when individuality reveals itself most fully. My concern for Basil absorbs me completely, said Mrs. Chester. He is everything to me, and that is exactly what should not be. That is the price you are paying now. Love him as much as you like, but remember that you are not just Basil's mother. You are a person, Adela Chester. If Basil's life is wrecked, it will break my heart, she replied. Mr. Pyne looked at her delicate face and the unhappy droop of her mouth. Adela Chester was a charming woman, and he did not wish to see her suffer. Well, he said, we shall see what can be done. Basil agreed at once to talk to Mr. Parker Pyne. He was eager to present his side of the story. The whole business is simply damnable. Mother is so narrow-minded and hopelessly prejudiced. If only she'd let go of all that, she'd see what a sport Betty is. And Betty, Basil sighed. Betty is being devilishly difficult. If only she'd help a little. If she'd just give up the lipstick for a day, things might be different. She seems to go out of her way to look, well, modern, I suppose, whenever she's near Mother. Mr. Pyne smiled. Betty and Mother are the two people I care for most in the world. I thought they'd hit it off straight away. You have a lot to learn, young man, said Mr. Parker Pyne. I wish you'd come with me and meet Betty, Basil suggested. Talk things over with her. Mr. Parker Pyne accepted the invitation readily. Betty, her sister, and her sister's husband lived in a small, ramshackle villa set back from the sea. Their way of life was refreshingly simple. The furnishings consisted of 3 chairs, a table, and beds. A cupboard built in the wall held the bare essentials: cups and plates. The brother-in-law, Hans, was a lively young man with a rebellious shock of blonde hair that stuck out in every direction. He rattled on in old-fashioned English at an incredible speed, pacing from corner to corner. His wife, Stella, was a graceful, fair-haired woman. Betty herself, red-haired and freckled, had mischievous eyes. Her makeup was considerably more restrained than it had been the day before at the Pinot d'Oro. After handing Pyne a cocktail, Betty winked and said, "So, you've been dragged into this ghastly war, too?" Mr. Parker Pyne nodded. "And whose side are you on? Are you for the young lovers or the disapproving lady? May I ask you a question? Fire away. Have you been entirely tactful in this business?" "Not in the least," Miss Gregg answered honestly. "But that old cat made me so angry." She glanced around to make sure Basil was out of earshot. "That woman drives me mad. All these years, she's kept Basil tied to her apron strings. It makes a man look like a fool. And Basil isn't a fool, really. And then there's her appalling snobbery. The perfect lady act. There is nothing wrong with being a lady, though it is perhaps a little old-fashioned these days." Betty Gregg suddenly winked again, a bit like putting Chippendale chairs in the attic during the Victorian era, isn't it? And then bringing them out again later and saying, "Aren't they divine?" Something of the sort. Betty Gregg grew thoughtful. "Perhaps you're right. I'll be frank with you. What really riles me is Basil and his constant nerves. He's so afraid I'll make a bad impression on his mother. That's what sent me off the deep end. Even now, I think he might chuck me if his mother played her cards right." "He might," Mr. Parker Pyne agreed, "if she knew how to play them. And are you going to tell her how? You know she'll never figure it out for herself. She'll just go on disapproving of me, but that doesn't help. If you were to back her up." She bit her lip, and Pyne met her gaze. Her blue eyes were steady. "I've heard of you, Mr. Parker Pyne. They say you're an expert on human nature. Do you think Basil and I will make a go of it, or not? I should like to ask you 3 questions. A compatibility test? Go ahead. Do you sleep with the window open or shut?" "Open. I love plenty of air." "Do you and Basil like the same kind of food?" "Yes." "Do you like to go to bed early?" "Between ourselves, rather early. By 10:30, I'm yawning, but I'm full of beans in the morning. Of course, I don't dare admit it." "You should suit each other very well," said Mr. Parker Pyne. "That seems a rather superficial test." "Not at all. I know of at least 7 cases where marriages were irreparably wrecked because the husband liked to sit up until midnight while the wife fell asleep at 9:30, and vice versa." "It's a pity everyone can't be happy," said Betty. "Basil and I, with his mother's blessing." Mr. Parker Pyne cleared his throat. "I think that might be arranged," he said. She looked at him doubtfully. "You're not pulling my leg, are you?" Mr. Parker Pyne's face remained an inscrutable mask. In his subsequent talks with Mrs. Chester, he soothed her without saying anything definite. An engagement, he reminded her, was not yet a marriage. He informed her he was going to Soller for a week and advised her to adopt an evasive line of conduct. Let the young people see that she was merely hesitant. He spent a very pleasant time in Soller, but upon his return, he was met by a most unexpected sight. No sooner had he entered the Pinot d'Oro than he saw Mrs. Chester and Betty Gregg. They were taking tea together, but Basil was nowhere to be seen. Mrs. Chester looked haggard. Betty looked positively ill. She wore almost no makeup, and her eyelids were swollen and red, as though she had been crying. They greeted Mr. Parker Pyne as friends, yet neither woman uttered a word about Basil. Suddenly, the girl let out a sharp, ragged breath, as if struck by a sudden pain. Mr. Pyne turned his head. Basil Chester was coming up the steps from the sea. With him was a girl of such breathtaking, exotic beauty that it defied description. Dark-skinned, with a magnificent figure, a fact impossible to ignore, as her entire attire consisted of nothing more than a pale blue crepe wrap. Her face was heavily coated in ochre-colored powder, her lips painted a fierce crimson orange, but the heavy makeup only served to heighten her remarkable loveliness. Basil seemed utterly unable to tear his eyes from her face. "You are very late, Basil," his mother said. "You were supposed to take Betty to Max today." "My fault entirely," the beautiful stranger drawled, her words heavy with a lazy elegance. "We wandered too far. Angel, be a dear and fetch me something with a bit of a kick in it." She kicked off a shoe, displaying a foot with toenails lacquered in emerald green to match her fingernails. Ignoring the women, the beauty leaned slightly toward Mr. Parker Pyne. "A ghastly island," she declared. "I was dying of boredom until I ran into Basil. He's such a pet." Mr. Parker Pyne, Miss Ramona, Mrs. Chester introduced them. The girl gave a slow, languid smile. "I think I shall just call you Parker," she murmured. "And my name is Dolores." Basil returned with the drinks, and Miss Ramona proceeded to conduct a conversation, principally with her eyes, directed at both men simultaneously. It was as if the women did not exist. Betty attempted to join the conversation once or twice, but the girl merely looked at her with blank, empty eyes. Suddenly, Dolores rose. "I think I'll toddle off. I'm staying at the other hotel. Is anyone going to escort me?" Basil sprang to his feet. "I am." "Basil, my dear," Mrs. Chester began. "I'll be back soon, Mother. Isn't he the perfect mother's boy?" Miss Ramona remarked to the air. "Always hovering. Aren't you, pet?" Basil looked flustered and turned a deep red. Miss Ramona nodded to Mrs. Chester, flashed a dazzling smile at Mr. Parker Pyne, and she and Basil sauntered away. An awkward silence followed their departure. Mr. Pyne was reluctant to speak first. Betty Gregg stood wringing her hands, staring out at the sea. Mrs. Chester was flushed with indignation. "Well," Betty said, her voice trembling slightly, "what do you think of our new acquisition?" "Somewhat exotic," Mr. Parker Pyne replied cautiously. "Exotic?" Betty gave a bitter laugh. "She is horrible, simply horrible," said Mrs. Chester. "Basil must have taken leave of his senses." "Basil is perfectly all right," Betty snapped. "Those toenails." Mrs. Chester shuddered with revulsion. Betty rose abruptly. "I think I won't stay for dinner after all, Mrs. Chester. I'm going home." "Oh, my dear, Basil will be so distressed." "Will he?" Betty replied with a hollow smile. "In any case, I think I'll go. I have a bit of a headache." She smiled at them and departed. Mrs. Chester turned to Mr. Parker Pyne. "I wish we had never come here." Mr. Pyne shook his head sadly. "You should never have gone away," Mrs. Chester said. "Had you been here, this wouldn't have happened." Mr. Parker Pyne felt slightly piqued. "I assure you, my dear lady, when it comes to young beauties, I am quite powerless to influence your son," he said. "He appears to have a very susceptible nature." "He was never like this before," Mrs. Chester replied, tears in her voice. "Well," said Mr. Pyne with forced cheerfulness, "this new infatuation seems, at least, to have put an end to his reckless passion for Miss Gregg. You must be pleased to some extent." "I don't know what you mean," Mrs. Chester declared. "Betty is a sweet child. She has been most devoted to Basil, and has behaved beautifully throughout this whole affair. My boy's gone mad, that's what I think." Mr. Parker Pyne received this startling change of heart with total equanimity. Female inconsistency was no novelty to him. "Not mad," Exactly, he said softly. Merely bewitched. But the creature is Italian. She is quite impossible, but very easy on the eyes. Mrs. Chester gave a sniff of disdain. Basil came bounding up the steps from the beach. Hello, Ma, here I am. Where's Betty? Gone home with a headache. I'm not surprised. Sulking, you mean? I think, Basil, you behaved very poorly toward her. For heaven's sake, Mother, don't start preaching. A fine life Betty and I would have if she's going to sulk every time I speak to another girl. You are engaged. Yes, engaged, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't have friends. Modern people must lead their own lives and try to get over this jealousy business. He paused. Look, Ma, if Betty isn't dining with us, I think I'll go back to the Mariposa. They asked me for dinner. Oh, Basil. The young man shot her a sharp look and ran down the steps. Mrs. Chester looked meaningfully at Mr. Parker Pyne. You see, she said. Yes, he saw. The crisis arrived 2 days later. Betty and Basil were to have gone on a long hike with a picnic. Betty arrived at the Pino d'Oro only to find that Basil had completely forgotten their plans and had gone off to Formentera for the day with Dolores Ramona and her party. Betty's lips tightened, but she gave no other sign of her feelings. She stood up and walked over to Mrs. Chester. The ladies were alone on the terrace. It's all right, Betty said. It doesn't matter, but I think the time has come to end it. She drew a signet ring from her finger, a gift from Basil. He had intended to buy a proper engagement ring later. Give this back to him, please, Mrs. Chester, she requested, and tell him it's quite all right. Tell him not to worry. Betty, darling, don't. He really does love you. It certainly looks like it, the girl remarked with a wry smile. No, I have some pride left. Tell him it's quite all right, and that I wish him luck. Basil returned at sunset and was met by a storm. When he saw his ring, he flushed slightly. So she's decided that, has she? Well, I dare say it's the best way out. Basil, to be honest, Mother, she and I haven't been hitting it off lately. And whose fault is that? Not entirely mine, I think. Jealousy is an ugly thing, and I don't see why you're taking it so hard. You were the one who begged me not to marry Betty. Yes, but I didn't know her then. Basil, dear, you aren't thinking of marrying that other one. I'd marry her like a shot if she'd have me, Basil said coolly. The trouble is, I'm afraid she won't have me. Mrs. Chester felt a cold shiver run down her spine. Turning away, her eyes sought out Mr. Pyne, who was peacefully reading in a shaded corner of the terrace. You must do something. You must do something. My boy, his life will be ruined. The impending ruin of Basil Chester's life was beginning to weigh heavily on Mr. Pyne. What can I possibly do? Go and talk to that awful creature. Buy her off if you must. That might prove expensive. I don't care. It is a pity you don't care, Mr. Pyne remarked. But perhaps there are other ways. She looked at him imploringly. Mr. Pyne shook his head. I won't promise anything, but I shall see what can be done, he murmured. I have dealt with such matters before. Mind you, not a word to Basil. That would ruin everything. Of course not. Mr. Parker Pyne returned from the Mariposa at midnight. Mrs. Chester had stayed up, waiting for him. Well, she asked, her breath held in anticipation. His eyes gave a mischievous glint. Tomorrow morning, the young woman you know as Señorita Dolores Ramona leaves Pollensa, and by evening she will have left the island. Oh, Mr. Pyne, how on earth did you manage it? It cost me nothing, he replied, his eyes twinkling again. I had a suspicion I might have some small influence over her, and I was right. You are wonderful. Nina Wycherley was quite correct. You must tell me your customary fee. Mr. Pyne raised a well-manicured hand in protest. Not a single penny. I have enjoyed myself immensely. I trust all will be well now. The boy will be upset, of course, when he finds she has vanished without leaving an address. Be gentle with him for a week or two. Oh, if only Betty will forgive him. She will forgive him soon enough. They will make a charming couple. By the way, I am also leaving tomorrow. Oh, Mr. Pyne, we shall miss you dreadfully. It is probably best that I go, he said, before your boy takes a fancy to yet another young woman. Mr. Parker Pyne leaned against the ship's rail, watching the lights of Palma recede into the distance. Beside him stood Dolores Ramona. A brilliant performance, Madeline, he said with professional appreciation. I'm glad I reached you by telegram. It's quite extraordinary, really. You are such a homebody at heart, and yet you came at a moment's notice.